very good. So, okay, so let's go ahead and now start with chapter 10 here. Okay, so y'all should be able to see chapter 10, which deals with the substance of justice here. Okay, so anyway, this is basically going to be the civil rights and civil liberties chapter that we're going to be covering here within Texas government. So, for those of all who have taken federal government already, these concepts should be familiar to you all, but we'll definitely take some time to go over what these concepts, how they relate to Texas government, because we definitely have a lot of examples from Texas government here in regards to a lot of these civil rights and civil liberties issues. So, of course, we're gonna tie this in here. So let's take a look at the objectives again, just like we did last time. So by the end of this chapter, you should be able to discuss issues of civil liberties in Texas, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, and abortions. We're definitely going to talk about all these particular issues. This is definitely one of my more favorite chapters when I teach this, not just in federal, but also within Texas, because I always love talking about the Bill of Rights, especially with my criminal justice background. I always like talking about the different protections that we have against government overreach. And so we'll definitely go more into detail on these here. And again, we're going to use a lot of examples from Texas because there's a lot of these different cases that come from Texas, especially like the Roe versus Wade case, which, of course, obviously was the case that had originally made abortion legal back in 1973. That case actually came out of the Dallas area. So there is, Texas has its fingerprints on a lot of these cases here, which we'll be talking about here within this chapter here. Describe issues of civil rights in Texas, including school segregation, education, changing racial attitudes, and civil rights for convicted criminals. So we are going to be taking a look at a lot of, again, there's going to be a lot of Supreme Court cases here within this this chapter here. We're going to take a look at Texas v. Johnson, the flag burning case. We're going to take a look at Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in schools and ultimately was used to build upon other Supreme Court cases later on, and ultimately got us the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which put an end to segregation and discrimination in American society when it comes to schools, businesses, and other public accommodations. And of course, we're also going to take a look at other cases involving education, such as the Edgewood v. Kirby case, when we look at school finance and school funding for schools across the state. And then we'll also take a look at some of these unfortunate incidences having to do with racial attitudes, such as what happened in Jasper, Texas, and Tulia, Texas. We'll be taking a look at those incidences. And we'll also, of course, be taking a look at, civil rights for convicted criminals, because some people might not be aware that, criminals, even though they are convicted and they're serving time in state prisons, that they do have this expectation of civil rights, especially when it comes to the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment, which we'll talk about here later on. Assess capital punishment in Texas, so we'll take a look at what capital punishment is. Obviously, of course, the death penalty. We'll take a look at how it plays out in Texas and the changing attitudes that some people, are having in regards to the death penalty, right? And we'll take a look at how Texas is the state with the most number of executions, and we'll also take a look. We'll talk a little about the execution process and how that operates in Texas in terms of the death row unit that they have over in Huntsville, which is looked at as the headquarters of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, which is the state agency that's responsible for the prisons in Texas. And then evaluate tort laws in Texas. We will take a look at tort laws, especially when it comes to medical malpractice allegations that were being made in the state. And we'll take a look at the tort reform laws that were passed in Texas in the 1990s under the George W. Bush administration. This was one of the things that he ran on when he was running for governor in the early 90s, was to try to reform the tort system, because a lot of doctors were being sued for medical malpractice, but the arguments were being made that the lawsuits were frivolous, and this was going to cause for doctors to no longer feel safe practicing in Texas. So we'll talk about that towards the end of the chapter. We'll talk about that on Wednesday here. Okay. So anyway, so I know we kind of left off on here last time. So let's talk about what civil liberties are. Now, civil liberty, do keep in mind that civil liberties and civil rights are not the same thing. They are used interchangeably. It also doesn't. It also is a little bit confusing that when we look at individual freedoms, we also talk about the idea of rights within civil liberties. So it can be a little bit confusing, but just bear with me on what the definition is, and so that way you're familiar with what a civil liberty is. So basically, a civil liberty is defined as an individual freedom such as speech, press, religion, and assembly. The protection of these liberties is essential to a vital democratic society. And generally, the protection of civil liberties requires forbidding government to take certain action. So the whole idea of civil liberties is this whole concept that we have certain freedoms, right? Certain protections against the government, right? That the government is not going to infringe upon these protections that we have because these are the aspects of a free society. A free society necessitates the need for people to speak out against their government, to be able to criticize the government without fear of anything happening to them, right? You should be able to feel comfortable enough to have opinions about your government, whether you will support them or not support them, right? To be critical, right? To criticize them. This is the hallmark of what we see in a strong democracy, right? Where the government should be encouraging discussion, should be encouraging people to be active in how they feel about their government and researching about their government and forming opinions about their government and ultimately expressing those thoughts and feelings and emotions, right? Especially nowadays where there's a lot of very strong political very strong political opinions that are influenced by a lot of these different events that are going on, whether it's Supreme Court decisions or actions being taken within society. So I'm sorry that I'm really tired today. It's Monday, but the point is that when we're talking about this idea of freedom of speech, that we should not feel like we can't speak out against our government just because the government doesn't like it. Well, tough, right? If the government doesn't like us criticizing them, then maybe the government should do a better job of being better for its citizens, right? I mean, that's kind of the notion that people have about when they talk about why they speak out against the government. People will say, well, they have a reason to, right? So this idea of constructing an atmosphere where people can feel comfortable to speak out against the government is essential to this idea of freedom of speech. And we'll talk more about this as we progress further. This idea of freedom of the press is also important, that journalists and people who are operating as the press should also feel that same sense of of comfort that we have with freedom of speech, right? That the press should not be intimidated, that the press should be able to press the government on these issues, because the press basically operates almost like a fourth invisible check on our government, right? We've studied the checks and balances in the previous chapter. You can make an argument that the press is kind of like the fourth shadow check on government, right? To always running stories to keep the government honest, trying to ask questions of our government leaders, right? And ensuring that the government leaders are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Because if we didn't have a fully functioning and independent press, then governmental leaders could try to get away with things that the public would not necessarily know about, because the public is either too busy to keep up with what's going on in the news, or they might not know where to look for this type of information. So the press, these are professional journalists who have gone to school and they've studied journalism, and they know how to perform journalism in an ethical manner. At least they're supposed to be. Then the press is definitely qualified to be able to bring up those issues that we're seeing within our government, right? So this freedom of press is extremely important. We'll also talk about freedom of religion, right? This idea that religion should be looked at as a personal matter, and that government should not favor one religion over another. Although it is a little bit complicated when it comes to religion within like schools and things like that. We'll talk about some of this here as well, how there are some exceptions, or that the wall of church and state is not quite as clear. But we will talk about it here, as well as assembly, right? The idea that we can peacefully assemble to protest against our government, right? We can demonstrate, we can organize, to form groups to try to see if we can, influence our government and try to get things that we want for our government to work on. All of these protections are, like we said, they're essential to a vital democratic society, because, as we mentioned in chapter 1, a democratic society where people care about what's going on, and they're active, and they're being involved, and they're questioning the government, and they're discussing it, that is the hallmark of a healthy democratic society. Because if nobody cares what's going on, then the government can try to get away with doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, because if no one's watching them, then that's going to allow for government to to be a little bit more relaxed and not be, the people keep them on their toes, so to speak, right? So that's why all of this is extremely important. And of course, the government is not supposed to be infringing upon those protections that we have, right? And so, of course, the incorporation aspect of this is the judicial rule that applies civil liberties in the National Bill of Rights to the states because of the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, the book talks about how that, and you probably learned more about this in federal government, that originally, this is kind of interesting, right? That the Bill of Rights did not technically apply to the states. It only applied to the federal government. Now, keep in mind that back when the country was being founded, if we remember our concept of federalism, like we discussed before, that the federal government was very small compared to how it is today. The state governments were basically the main form of governments that people interacted with on a day-to-day basis. Back then, and even today as well, we still see that. If you like think to yourself, okay, who are you more likely to interact with when it comes to government officials? It's probably going to be either the state or your local government officials, right? Because they're closer to you, right? Especially local governments, right? Local governments are closer to the people because they're within the community, right? Whereas the federal government, they might be here, but they're more so concentrated like over in Washington. Now, of course, we have the distinction of having a lot of federal presence because we live near an international border. But imagine if we live like in Kansas, right? We probably never see any federal agents except your neighborhood postman, right? Just with the mail, right? That's usually in these small rural communities, like in the interior of the United States. That may be the only federal employee that you ever run into, right? Is your postal, is your mailman or your postal service worker. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that originally that the state and local governments were basically the ones who you would interact with on a daily basis. And so you did have situations before the Civil War happened where there was no expectation of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, where states could make their own state religion if they wanted to. They could suppress people for speaking out against the state government if they wanted to, because originally, like I said, and this is a case, Barron versus Baltimore, which talked about this. Originally, the Bill of Rights only applied to the national government, but once we had the 14th Amendment that was passed after the Civil War ended, we had what was called the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which incorporated these Bill of Rights to where the states now had to follow them. And this was also done on that case-by-case basis here. So it wasn't just a blanket incorporation. And that's why there's going to be a lot of these cases that deal with these types of incorporations. So they do get incorporated. The state requirement for the states having to follow the Bill of Rights is incorporated into the Constitution through the 14th Amendment, but it had to be done on a case-by-case basis. So I'll give you some examples. Like the Gitlow case was the example of freedom of speech, right? So freedom of expression. So limits on freedom of speech, examples: inciting violence, racist propaganda, terrorist recruitment, burning of American flags. Are these considered examples of freedom of speech, or do some of these go too far? That's what the book is asking, right? And so what we're going to talk about here is we're going to talk about that, yes, that there are limits to this concept of freedom of speech. Not necessarily that you are limited in saying it, because as I like to say to people, it's not like that episode of Family Guy where Peter's being censored by the FCC, every time he says a curse word in his house. It's not like the government's doing that, no. But the government will go after you if you engage in some of this criminal activity, because when you're talking about inciting violence and terrorist recruitment, you cannot use that as freedom of speech because you are engaging in criminal activity, right? So, and a lot of this is a little bit complicated because some people they might confuse this with this whole idea. Well, it's a free country; I can say whatever I want. Well, yes, technically you can, but if let's say you're one of these KKK members and you're at one of these rallies and you're going to say that you're going to go bomb someone's house tonight, well, that's no longer freedom of speech, right? Because now you've communicated a criminal threat. However, if let's say you're just spouting off racist stuff, like what the KKK says, and you're just speaking in generalities, then technically that is considered okay. That is considered that is considered protected free speech. There's the Brandenburg v. Ohio case that talked about this, right? Because there were some KKK members who were spouting off, their racist rhetoric, and people, of course, were offended by it, and they wanted for them to stop. And ultimately, they were arrested on this, but it got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that yes, that is allowed, even if it's stuff that's very offensive, even if it's speech that goes way beyond the mainstream, that right to say that stuff has to be protected. because as it says down here, democracy requires not only majority rule, but also minority rights. Because the idea is that the majority is always, the majority never has to worry about their rights being, restricted or trampled upon, because they're always going to be in the majority, right? They're always going to be able to win elections and be able to get their voices heard. But it's the minority people, the people who might not be able to gain protection through the political process. Their rights also have to be respected because they are in the minority and they are not going to be able to gain that political power because they're in the minority. So when you look at some of these minority groups or these far out groups that are beyond the mainstream, yes, most people won't like what they say or what they, or the rhetoric that they're saying, right? But that still has to be protected because freedom of speech is not dependent on whether people agree or disagree with it, right? Because that, this idea of freedom of speech goes beyond what people agree with, right? Because it's not quite freedom of speech. It then becomes only freedom of speech with things that you agree with, right? So I hope this makes sense to y'all, right? That this freedom of speech is something that is the hallmark of a free society where people should be able to say those things, as long as it's something that it's not a, communicable, criminal threat or things like that. But if people are saying things that people don't agree with, then people should have the right to say those things, even if the majority of the people don't agree with it. There's a famous quote that says, it's attributed to different people, but basically it says, while I disagree with what you say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. And that's what I believe encapsulates this idea of freedom of speech, right? This idea that we shouldn't just extend freedom of speech just for things that we agree with, right? That we should be able to, that people, even if they have different viewpoints, and even if it's very outlandish viewpoints, even if it's things that are racist and people that wouldn't necessarily agree with those things because they wouldn't be considered sensible, that doesn't mean that we should just, quiet those people, and regardless, even if it's stuff that and again, there's different, obviously, of course, there's different aspects of this. Like I know there's some of these organizations like you probably heard of the Westboro Baptist Church, where they speak out, because of their very strong religious viewpoints when it comes to the LGBTQ community. And of course, this is stuff that definitely tends to be looked at as very insensitive and things like that. So as well as the KKK that we talked about. But again, the reason why they're allowed to still say those things is because of this idea of freedom of speech, that the minority should also be protected to be able to say those things, regardless of how the general public feels. Now, again, as long as it doesn't become criminal in nature, right? Because like I said, if you're just sprouting off a bunch of racist things, but you're not actually communicating that you're going to go after someone at a certain time, then that's okay. But if you do say that we're going to go to someone's house, we're going to go do this, and this, that is no longer protected because now that is a criminal threat. And let's talk about some of these other cases. So the Gitlow v. New York case. This is the case that incorporated freedom of speech into that it incorporated it through the 14th Amendment to now apply to the states, right? So in the Gitlow case, which is barely going to be over 100 years, almost 100 years old in 2 years, this, of course, is what allows for states to not restrict people's freedom of speech, right? There's also non-speech acts of freedom of speech, such as symbolic speech, which is also protected. There's another case that's not mentioned here, but there's another case before Gitlow. There was the Schenck v. United States case, where Mr. Schenck was he was passing out anti-war pamphlets, because this was during the time of America's involvement in World War I, and there was there were some people within American society, especially like the socialists and some of these anarchists and things like that, who were not wanting for the United States to get involved in World War I, so they were passing out these pamphlets to basically not submit to the to the draft, and so this violated the Espionage Act, and so Schenck was arrested for this. And he was claiming that this was in violation of his freedom of speech. So ultimately, Schenck was ruled against because Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that's when he famously said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So ultimately, Schenck was, his conviction was upheld because of, because of the times of war and things like that. Now, of course, the Supreme Court has kind of, and I know this is a little bit confusing, but just note that, that the Supreme Court nowadays has kind of moved away from the Schenck case, so to speak, where now there needs to be more levels of scrutiny. They call this like strict scrutiny and things like that. There needs to be more levels of scrutiny where if the government is going to infringe upon someone's right to say things or print some things, because again, that's also considered speech, right? Speech is not just saying things, but it's also, printed words, printed material, as well as symbolic speech like we're going to get here with the Texas flag here, that if the government is going to try to suppress that type of speech, they have to be able to prove, why they need to do it. And that's what the strict scrutiny test is. But again, don't really worry too much about that right now. Let's get to Texas v. Johnson here. This is also another important case. This happened in Texas, again in Dallas, for the 1984 Republican National Convention, which we'll talk about the conventions later on in this class. This is basically where after the primary season ends and you have the formal nomination for the candidates for president. But the Democrats and Republicans, they have their national conventions, and this usually happens in the summer, before the presidential election. So next summer, or I guess this upcoming summer that's coming up in 2024, we're going to have the Republican and Democrat national conventions again to formally nominate their candidates for the 2024 presidential election. But regardless, so in 1984, Reagan he gets the nomination to run again on the Republican side, and so you have some protesters in Dallas who. And that's usually going to happen. There's always going to be protesters at these conventions because these conventions it's one of the few times where all of the major party elites within either the Democrat or Republican Party, depending on which convention is meeting in that city, that's one of the few times where you have all the major Democrats and all the major Republicans going to that convention at the same time. So of course, this is going to attract people like either supporters or also protesters who, let's say, they don't agree with the Republicans or they don't agree with the Democrats. So you're going to have opposing people going to these conventions. It's always been happening, and it will continue to happen, like I said, because of the nature of these conventions. So anyway, but to make a long story short, what happened was that Mr. Johnson ended up burning an American flag there, and he was arrested because this violated a Texas law that made it illegal for people to engage in flag burning. It got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1989, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Johnson, striking down the Texas law, basically saying that burning an American flag is protected free speech. Now, again, it's one of the more outlandish ones, right? A lot of people do not agree with this, right? This is very offensive. But again, I want you all to understand this is the nature of freedom of speech, right? It's kind of like a double-edged sword, so to speak, right? It's easy to support freedom of speech when it's something that you agree with, right? But what if it's something that you don't agree with, right? Or what if it's something that, and then we could get into a big discussion about this idea of freedom of speech. What about if, like, let's say people are spreading misinformation on Twitter and things like that, right? Or disinformation, right? Is that something that needs to be regulated, or does that fall in line with freedom of speech? And I don't have the answers to that. If I had the answers to that, I'd probably be in Washington right now. I don't have the answers to, whether that's something that, does the government have the authority to step in if, let's say, something is, because I know we've got libel and slander and all that stuff, but some of these other aspects of freedom of speech are a little bit more, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? It's a little more complicated to, to determine whether someone is actually outright lying, or maybe they're just misinformed or things like that. It's definitely something that, again, we need to definitely look at as a society in terms of, is this kind of something like we kind of take the good and the bad when it comes to freedom of speech? But again, I don't have the answers to this, but I want to present you all with what freedom of speech is and how that, yes, for the most part, you are free to be able to speak those things when it comes to criticizing the government. But when it starts to go into criminal activity and criminal conspiracy, that's no longer considered, freedom of speech, right? Like we saw recently some of these people who engaged in the January 6th, the Capitol issue. Some of them have already been, arrested and are serving for some of these crimes like espionage, conspiracy, and all of that. Because and a lot of them did claim that this was freedom of speech, but again, you cannot claim it as freedom of speech if you're actually going to engage in criminal activity with it. So hopefully that makes sense to you all here. Okay, now let's go ahead and move on now to freedom of religion here really quickly. Okay, now so we kind of touched on. Let me just also make sure if there's anything else I need to talk about when it comes to freedom of speech. Or I'm trying to see that if there's anything else that I need to touch on really quickly when it comes to freedom. I think we covered pretty much the basics of freedom of speech. That again, that you're not free from consequences, right? That again, that if it's communicable criminal activity, that's not going to be protected under freedom of speech. So let's go to freedom of religion really quickly. If I think of because I feel like I'm missing something, but that's fine. If not, then let's just continue. So freedom of religion. Okay, so let's get to freedom of religion. And now, of course, all of this is within the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution. So freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is described as there's two aspects to freedom of religion, right? There's the establishment clause, which is up here, no law respecting an establishment of religion. And there's also the free exercise clause. So we're going to, this is how the freedom of religion is broken down, right? So the no law respecting an establishment of religion, this is basically saying that the United States is not going to be creating an official religion that everyone has to follow, nor is it going to favor one religion over another, right? So these are the interpretations. So we have what's called the wall of separation between church and state, which I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with this concept, right? This idea that the government and the churches should not be commingling with each other, that we should have that separation, that the government's over here and the church is on the other side of the wall, and that's the way it should be, right? That's the strict interpretation of the wall of separation of church and state. And then, of course, within that also government may, but what we see here is that this doesn't mean specifically, at least not everyone believes with the strict interpretation of the wall of separation of church and state. Some people feel that government and religion can work together as long as it says here, government may aid but show no preference, right? Now, some examples of this would be, let me give you all a quick example of this. So in the high schools, and I do remember this because I still teach in the high school, I still teach these government classes in the high schools. We have some of these religious organizations, such as, you probably heard of FCA, right? The Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and they are still very active on these public schools. So some people might think to themselves, okay, so why is it possible? Why can you have faith-based organizations operating within schools? Well, the reason why the FCA is allowed to operate is because it's purely voluntary, right? That it's for people who want to pursue this, who want to go to the after-school events, and that's another thing, right? They're after school, so whoever wants to go, they're making the effort to go, right? This isn't something that, it's not mandatory, right? It's not compulsory. It's not, they're not making all the students go to this. Now, if they did, if every student had to join FCA, then that would be a violation of the freedom of religion, right? Because now you're making all the students engage in this type of activity. This is also why in the 1960s, we had the Engel v. Vital case, which basically struck down the practice of school prayer in schools being led by the schools. I know I kind of said that a little bit, that was kind of confusing, but let me reiterate that. So before the Vital case, you had public schools that were reciting Christian prayers, right? To start the school day, you had prayers that were being led by the teachers and the staffers and the principals and all that, right? Now, this was struck down in the Vital case as being unconstitutional because this violated the freedom of religion. Because what was happening is that you had the schools that were showing preference for one religion over another, right? Because they were reciting Christian prayers. So the issue here, I'm sure you all see the issue here, right? Is that, that's assuming that everyone in that school is Christian, but as we know, that's not the case, right? But the United States is a very diverse country, not just when it comes to people and languages, but also with religion, and even more so now. We're seeing more of a variety of religious beliefs in the United States, including even the idea of atheism, the idea to not believe in a religion, right? To not have religious beliefs. So imagine if, let's say, you're a Jewish student, or you're a Muslim student, or you're an atheist, right? That could be considered offensive, right? If you would have to make a prayer in a faith that you don't believe in, right? So again, this is why the Supreme Court stepped in and put a stop to this, because religion is supposed to be a personal matter, right? Again, it's not supposed to establish a religion that everyone has to follow within the schools, right? So now it's done in a way where, as long as it's not mandatory and it's not compulsory, that's okay for governments to still engage, to still have religious organizations, operate, here in the public school. So I know this can be a little bit confusing, but I want to explain to you all why it can be allowed in these circumstances, right? As long as it's not mandatory. Now, we also have the free exercise clause. Texas Constitution Article 1, Section 4 talks about how that, again, it mirrors what we see within the U.S. Constitution, that people should be able to exercise their faith. When it comes to the free exercise clause, it's talking about this idea that people should be able to have that freedom to exercise their faith how they want to, right? Like an example would be like let's say you consider yourself like Catholic or whatever, right? And let's say, you have your Sunday mass or whatever, but let's say you decide that for whatever reason you're not interested in going. That's the government's not going to step in and be asking you why you didn't go to mass on Sunday, right? Or any or whatever faith any other faiths, whatever time that they have their services. It's not the government's business to be checking on people whether they're going to church or not. That is something that is a personal matter, and that's between them and their faith. And how people exercise their faith is up to them, right? This would be like, so like some people there, we all probably know some people that are there every Sunday. Some people are only there on special occasions, like for the holidays, and some people just don't go at all. And that's okay, because at least to the government, right? Because that's an issue that's left up between them and the faith that they're members of. But politics of religious freedom is often characterized by inconsistency and hypocrisy. So the book talks about how that, and we definitely see this a lot in Texas, right? Let me see. I think it talks about it. Yeah, it talks about it a little bit later here. Yeah, here's the Vital case I was talking about here, right? So what it's talking about here is that, and not just in Texas, but in a lot of these places, especially more so in some parts of the country than others, we tend to see a lot of these cases being brought up in some of these states, and Texas is no stranger to these cases, where you have local governments, local entities that that they get influenced by the religious, how do I say it, the nature of the community, right? Because Texas tends to be a very conservative state, and a big reason for that is because of the overwhelming religious influence that we see in Texas, especially when it comes to like evangelicals and Protestant faiths, like when especially like the Baptist faith. The Baptist faith is very strong in Texas, not necessarily here in the Valley, but more so up north. Like I mentioned, when I was staying in Waco 2 years ago, Baptist church on every corner, right? It's considered the Baptist capital of the world. So with that being said, it makes sense that if you're in a community that tends to be very religious, and you also see this more so in rural communities, right, where religion tends to be looked at a little bit more strongly in these rural communities as opposed to maybe urban communities, you're going to have situations where the community is going to want for more religious practice, especially within the schools. But again, we're going to see how this played out, right? So again, freedom of religion, right? So it protects freedom to believe or and disbelieve, right? And so again, prayer in schools ruled unconstitutional under the Engel v. Vital case, like I mentioned right now. Prayer is looked at as a Christian ritual, but again, the issue there in the Vital case was that this was being led by the government, and so you had a situation where the government was favoring one religion over another by leading a Christian prayer. See and the issue, and it's not also just it's not also just the idea that it's a Christian prayer, but a prayer in general, right? Because again, like I talked about, what about the atheist students, or maybe the agnostic students who maybe they don't necessarily believe in a certain, like a certain spiritual being or something like that. Maybe they're more in line with like, theories about the universe or things like that, right? They don't necessarily have a deity, so to speak, right? So we have those views have to also be respected, because if they're not, then what's the point of having freedom of religion, right? Because it's the idea, it's the freedom to believe or disbelieve, and also to also even pick and choose what you believe or not believe in, right? Because people have different interpretations within these different religions, right? So because again, there's so much of this that's going on, that's why it's usually just better that the government kind of just stay out of it, so to speak. At least that's why a lot of people tend to favor a strong wall of separation of church and state. Like an example would be like, like I know, like several years back, there's been, and this actually happened. Like you can look this up online, where because I teach about this in my federal government class, where in Oklahoma, at the state capitol, there was the decision to put the Ten Commandments there on the grounds of the state capitol. So some groups felt that that was a violation of freedom of religion. So we had the Church of Satan, and this actually is true. Like you can look this up. They wanted to include their own display, because they were making the argument, well, we're operating under freedom of religion, so why is it that the Christians get to put their display, but the Satanists don't get to, right? So that's why, I've talked about, like for me personally, that's why I think a lot of places they just say, okay, you know what, we're just not going to have any religious imagery, because if we include one, then we have to include all of them. So it's just easier just not to include any of them, right? And things like that. So that's why I think a lot of people tend to gravitate more towards secularism, which is the absence of religious ideas within anything. but people still feel that there's still a lot of disagreement, right, on this, right? But anyway, so let's move to some of these other examples, like here, like in Texas, right? So the reading of the Lord's Prayer and Scripture have been ruled unconstitutional. So what Texas has decided to do, to kind of replace this, is the Pledge of Allegiance. We're talking about the here right now, but right, the Vital case basically said that you cannot have prayer that's being led by the schools, whether it's teachers or principals or other staffers, because they're government employees. They are not allowed to be leading those prayers. In Santa Fe, Texas, which some of y'all you might have heard of this town before. Not for this, but a couple of years ago, remember there was that shooting there at the high school. I don't know if y'all remember this one. This Santa Fe is a little bit south of Houston, and I do have a personal story with this, not with the shooting. I'm thankful that I wasn't there for that, but it's unfortunate that it happened. But I think it was about a couple of years after the shooting happened. I was driving back with my ex-girlfriend. She lives in Lake Jackson, which is very close to there. And we were coming back from Galveston, and we actually cut through Santa Fe, to get to Lake Jackson. And we actually saw that there was still a lot of messages there, like Santa Fe strong. Like you can tell, like the community is still. It's probably something they're going to deal with for the rest of their lives, because it's a very tiny community, very small, very rural. So it's probably something that the community is never going to forget, unfortunately, because of just the magnitude of that, and of course the size of the community. So yeah, I was able to see that a lot of the signs, like the businesses there, they still have Santa Fe strong and all that. I don't know if they still have them today, because that was probably about 4 years ago that I drove through there. But it wouldn't shock me if they still had that. But yeah, unfortunately, they had one of those mass shootings there. But before the mass shooting in Santa Fe, they had a controversy where they allowed for students to recite a pregame message before the football games, and this was ruled unconstitutional because some people in the communities, Catholics and Mormons, they were making the argument that, hey, the message is always going to be read by these Protestant students because they are overwhelmingly in the majority, right? Because Santa Fe, the majority of the people in that community are Protestant evangelicals. So it's going to be very rare, if ever, that you would have a non-evangelical message being read. And even beforehand, the Santa Fe School District was even going further than this. They also had teachers pass out pamphlets for churches and the churches, church events and revivals and things like that. So that was also ruled unconstitutional because that's not allowed for people to be passing that out for the teachers, right? If the students wanted to do that, that's a different story. But for sure, people who are working there are not, we're not able to do so. Same thing with the pregame messages, because again, this was looked at as being discriminatory to the minority, the religious minority there in the Santa Fe community. Now, in another community here, let me just make sure that I got the school district right, because I'm taking a look at the notes here. Okay, so in this community, this was in the Beaumont area. This was so again, a little bit further to the east of Santa Fe. This is going more towards Louisiana. Within this school district, cheerleaders were wanting to hold banners with inspirational messages that were religious in nature. So the courts did rule that was okay, because since that was not being led by the school, that was considered okay because that was their own personal message. So if the cheerleaders personally wanted to, hold that banner up with their own personal message, even if it was religious, that was considered okay, even though it was on school grounds and at a school event. So you see how some of these are kind of a little bit, it's kind of, it's not really too clear cut of a requirement. Well, what I can tell you all, though, is that from what I've been reading from these different cases and studying this stuff, teaching all these years, is that the main thing that the courts usually tend to look at is, okay, is it being led by the students or is it being led by the school? Because if the students are praying by themselves, that's fine, because they have that right to do so, because freedom of religion also allows for them to believe if they want to. The problem is when the schools start leading it, right? Because now the schools are favoring one religion over another. So in this case with the cheerleaders, because it was being done, the schools weren't making them do this, right? This was something that, hey, the schools let them hold their banners and they can decide what they want to put on it. So if they wanted to put something religious, that was up to the students to decide. However, there's still some of there are still some points of contention here. And what I mean by this is that this is not clear cut at all. Like another example is can high school coaches lead, prayers after football games? Like when they kneel, there at midfield, when the two teams, they kind of, they kneel together and they give a prayer. Is that something where, do the students have to lead it, or, can the coaches get involved? Because there was also this controversy where one of these coaches in Texas also, he got suspended, because he was doing that, but then he was able to get his job back. And so it's, you know, now again, and I'm not trying to like pick sides on this. I know, like, I can also explain, in my personal circumstance, what I try to do is, like, let's say I'm responding to an email to a student, and let's say, they're talking to me about something, there's something that, let's say that something's going on in their life. I definitely try to make sure that I don't like inject God in there, because since I'm acting as a member of the government, I don't feel that it's appropriate for me to talk about religion in like my official capacity as a professor. So I definitely try to shy away from that. I know some other people don't, but for me personally, I feel that that would be, for me, that would be a violation of freedom of religion if I started interjecting my own religious viewpoints in that email, because it's not my personal email, right? I'm operating, as a professor, in that official capacity. So I feel that I need to, keep that at bay, so to speak, right? At least that's the way I see it. Some people might not see it that way, but I see it that way. And the reason why I bring that up as an example is that it's not so clear cut, right? That there is a lot of gray areas. Other examples have been deemed personal expressions, such as "under God" added to the Texas Pledge. So, and you all are probably familiar with this, right? Because in Texas, I mean, I saw it even this morning, right? Where, at the high school that was at, where the students, stand up to do the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, technically, the students do not have to stand up. We did have it's the West Virginia School Board case. I talk more about this in federal government, where you had these group of Jehovah's Witnesses who did not want for their child to stand up for the pledge because, and again, if I butcher this, I do apologize. I don't know if any of y'all are Jehovah's Witnesses. So again, I'm not one, but I'm just going off of what I read. That for the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're very strict about, pledging authority. Like they believe they only pledge authority to God, right? That they don't necessarily pledge authority to, like, man-made constructions when we talk about like governments or entities, right? That they feel that their only allegiance is to God and things like that. So that's why they felt that it was inappropriate for their child to be reciting this pledge. And so the Supreme Court ultimately ruled in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So technically, students are not made to stand up for the pledge. Like, you do not have to stand up for the pledge. But sometimes we've also seen some controversies, like in Texas schools, where some students have tried to assert that right, and the school districts will still basically go after them, right? And then that also happened recently in Texas a couple of years ago as well, where we had one student who, I don't recall the name of that case. I would have to, but it is on Google. You can look it up as well, where there was a situation where a student did not want to stand for the pledge, and then they got in trouble with one of these school districts, which I mean, that is a violation of free religion, because again, we have that West Virginia case. But how many of these people actually, keep up with these Supreme Court cases? You know what I mean? Like, let me give you all one more quick example. So I saw the other day that there was an article where a student in a school district in Texas got in trouble for having it was a male student, they had their hair too long. But we just had the Crown Act that was passed that put an end to that, where male hair discrimination was no longer legal. So now I'm kind of looking to see, like, well, what gives here? So we passed the law, but how do you actually enforce it? You know what I mean? So I don't know. That's something that I need to also do some research. Maybe I'll reach out to my state rep on that, and maybe he can take a look at it and see if he can get me an answer to that. But anyway, with that being said, I wanted to give you all some examples of how there's a lot of these cases with religion here in Texas. And so what Texas has done, to kind of skirt this, this idea of not being able to pray in schools, what they do now is they have the pledge, right? And then they have the moment of silence where you can use it to pray if you want to, but it's not mandatory. And so the under God aspect was added under the Texas Pledge, and again, there was some controversy with this, but then the courts ruled that because it has a secular purpose, because it was paralleling the national pledge, right? That they didn't put under God as a religious reason. They did it because, well, the national pledge has it, so we're just going to reflect on that. And then within the national pledge, there's also controversy about, well, should under God be in there as well? And the courts have also deferred to, like, tradition, that it might not necessarily be meaning the Judeo-Christian God, but it might be meaning more like, you know, just a higher being in general. But then of course now we have the atheists that come in, and so now it's just that there's still a lot of it's open for debate is what I'm trying to say. I do not have all the answers to this. I'm just presenting to you all what the courts have found so far, and in some cases, you know, the courts even they have disagreed on some of these, right? It's a very touchy subject because again, since the Constitution is not clear about what technically constitutes you know, you know, if the wall should be strict or not so strict, that's something, you know, for the courts to decide. That's why we have some of these different interpretations. And then lastly, let's talk about a famous freedom of religion issue in Texas that came out from our own backyard. I live in the city of Mission. If any of you are familiar with Mission, you know that the La Lomita Chapel is basically it's what we associate here in the city of Mission, right? It's on our city logo. It's definitely a big part of our heritage here, you know, here in the city of Mission. So the La Lomita Chapel, of course, is the chapel that if you go south on, and again, if you're not familiar with Mission, you might not know about this, but I'll explain. So since I've lived here in Mission for about 15 years. If you go south on Conway all the way, you know, going towards towards the Rio Grande, you will come across the La Lomita Chapel complex, right? So it's right there along the Rio Grande. And so the controversy, and there's a good video that they did a story on this with MEC News, where they actually interviewed Father Roy Snipes, who has been, you know, he's been my priest for many years, you know, because the church that I go to is there at Lady Guadalupe there there in Mission. Also a personal story. He's also been my longtime priest for when I was very little, because he was also the priest over in Roma, Texas, which is where my family is all from. So I got to know him at a very, very young age. So then he goes to Mission and then I come to Mission. So it's kind of interesting. He's a very cool guy, very cool guy. But anyway, so the argument that was being made by the diocese here, you know, in the Bronzeville diocese here in South Texas, was that the federal government was going to survey the land in order to build a border wall there at the La Lomita Chapel. So basically, the original plans were going to have the La Lomita Chapel on the opposite side of the border wall. So Father Roy, as well as the other leaders of the Catholic Church here, they filed a lawsuit because they filed a lawsuit because they were trying to refuse the border wall surveyors due to the sacred nature of space. So they were asserting a freedom of religion argument that the border wall would violate their freedom of religion to practice their religion safely, right? Because they were making the argument that, hey, we've had this chapel for all these years. There's we don't feel that this is a dangerous place. We should have the right to be able to worship freely on this sacred ground because it's been sacred for over 100 years, right? So that was the argument that was being made by the Catholic Church here, and ultimately that argument won out, and so the courts did rule in favor of the church here, and so the border wall surveyors, were be allowed to refuse the border wall surveyors, and then ultimately the plans to build their La Lomita were scrapped, and so for now the La Lomita Chapel is safe. But again, I wanted to explain to you all how even locally, this idea of freedom of religion can also play about here. Okay, so let's see. So I know we got several of these to go through, and then we can kind of finish this off. Yeah, we can kind of finish this off next time here. So that's fine. We can go because I don't want to get started on the Second Amendment because this is going to take probably several minutes here. So we can kind of end here a little bit early. So let me go ahead and stop the share and stop the record here. Okay.